Alrighty, good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Baird. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Anunimo, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Red River Métis. Additionally, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. And of course, we are gathered here today for the Winnipeg launch of Emily Grafton's newest book, Divided Power: How Federalism Undermines Reconciliation. Let's hear a round of applause for Emily. And of course, we are grateful to Fernwood Publishing for their help in making this evening become a reality today. So just a moment, after I'm done my introductions, there's going to be a presentation followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have a question tonight, just raise your hand enough for me to see, or just make me aware that you have a question. And I'll come by with this wireless microphone solely to ensure that you're heard on tonight's live stream for those watching at home. And then of course, I'll be back at the end to review how the signing procedure is going to go to the table to my right. But for now, I'd like to welcome up Tanya Andrzejewska, the Acquisitions and Development Editor at Fernwood, to introduce Emily. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tanya Andrzejewska. I'm an editor at Fernwood Publishing, and I got to work with Emily on this book. So I'm very pleased to welcome you here to this launch of Divided Power, and special thanks to McNally Robinson for hosting us. It's really exciting to see the support for Emily and for this great book. Divided Power is a really formidable project. It helps us think through the ways that Canada's commitments to reconciliation are so profoundly restricted by the very designs of state. And in the book, Emily walks us through the question of how Canada can possibly enact meaningful reconciliation when the state's divisions of power are constantly trying to control Indigenous political life and sovereignty. But Emily also walks us through the refusals and expressions of sovereignty as well. So federalism is the context, but not the end of the story. And it's especially meaningful that Emily chose to publish with Fernwood. So thanks, Emily, because this is we share the roots here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory in the Red River Métis. Fernwood is an academic, independent academic publisher, and we have a commitment to publish books that are explicitly critical of colonialism, oppression, and subjugation in its many forms. So Emily traveled to Winnipeg from Regina to be here for this launch. Currently, Emily is an associate professor of politics and international studies at the University of Regina, where she teaches courses on Indigenous rights, reconciliation, feminism, and gender politics, international relations, and Canadian government. And she explains that these curricula are interconnected, and they highlight how the various systems of oppression embedded within the state structures contribute to marginalization. Emily is impressively published. She is the co-editor of Canadian Settler Colonialism with the University of Regina Press, and of the On Settler Colonialism in Canada series, also with the U of R Press. On top of that, she's published more than 30 journal articles, book chapters, government and community reports. So this is amazing expertise that we get to hear from today and read from too. She currently serves on the board of the Canadian Political Science Association and lives in Regina with her husband Matt and their 2 children, Sebastian and Elliot, who are also here. So welcome. I'll hand it over to you, Emily. Thank you for being here and for sharing your amazing wisdom with us. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks.
Hey, hi. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, we're good? Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I am overwhelmed by this sea of beautiful, familiar, friendly faces. I also want to thank Tanya for that introduction. As mentioned, she was the development editor on this book, and I found Tanya to be very kind, patient, and attentive to my many, many questions, and also my insecurities, and perhaps most importantly, to my writing. I genuinely know that this book would not exist without you, so thank you. I also want to extend a thank you to John Taves and Daniel Ware and the other staff at McNally that have made this possible. I grew up here in Winnipeg. This is my first book talk here in Winnipeg. It means a lot to me to see so many friends and family in the audience. But it's also such a moment to drive up to a place like McNally Robinson, which is so, I think, profound in Winnipeg's book-loving scene. It's a place where in my youth, I was a waitress at the Prairie Ink. And as I told my dear friend Tanya, that just today at lunch, I have an uncle and an aunt who have also launched books here. So it feels like I'm contributing a little bit to a family legacy. So again, thank you all for coming. Now, I wanted to start us off by talking about the late philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He suggested that instead of trying to pin down the meaning of big ideas with long histories, instead, it's more helpful to understand the ideas through narratives. And so with that in mind, I'm going to present to you my book as a narrative or a story. This story is about the making of the Canadian state, colonial dispossession, and implications for Indigenous peoples. Now I see myself in this story. My Métis ancestors navigated dispossession, and I often say I am the product of its assimilation. So my Métis ancestors were fur traders. They worked the waterways from the Great Lakes all the way to Cumberland House in what is now Saskatchewan. They later settled in the Red River, receiving half-breed land allotment in St. Francois Xavier. As many in this room know, because we are all related, they then moved down to southern Manitoba in the Pembina Mountain region, and then back up to the Red River region in St. Boniface. Now I share this in part to situate my ancestors in relation to the Métis. Also, it is through these generations that I can map clear markers of my ancestors contributing to the building of the Métis people, and also clear markers of language and cultural loss, in particular for my generation. Now, my book argues that this story thread, that of dispossession, is core to the operation of Canada. Divided power, how federalism undermines reconciliation, is about the power of colonialism structured within the state. It argues that our country's attempts of reconciliation are limited because federalism undermines the movement. Now, federalism is an organizational approach to political power sharing between two orders of government. Here in Canada, you will know these as a split of power between the feds and the provinces. These are autonomous or sovereign powers, and that just means that they are independent political decision makers. I argue in my book that federalism anchors Indigenous peoples' dispossession in Canada. This is because settler colonialism operates through a simple equation: dispossess Indigenous peoples of lands, being, and agency to provide settlers with benefits related to economic, social, and political power. Now, I trace this equation through the division of constitutional powers that outline the Canadian Federation. I suggest that when we ask, Are Indigenous matters out of the federal or provincial government? We instill this equation that we don't easily, as a country, immediately lean into the curiosity. Is this a political matter for the colonial state or for an Indigenous order of government? We underscore the settler coloniality of federalism. Or, put another way, we concede to Indigenous dispossession. Now on this, I'd like to expand. I write in my book, this federalist structure inherently denies powers to Indigenous orders of government. The denial of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination and agency is a central feature of settler colonial oppression and thus a central concern for reconciliation. To support this argument, I explore settler colonial narratives. These are a tool developed in settler colonial contexts to strip any place of indigeneity and thereby strip Indigenous peoples of associated rights. Settler colonial narratives create formative stories that replace Indigenous ties to place and power. These are then reframed by settler encroachment and settler might. So settler colonial narratives are manufactured stories. They silence and oppress Indigenous peoples' histories and experiences. And it is in this silence that injustice occurs. Now in my book, I tie this silencing and injustice to Canada's divided powers. It is in the founding of Canada and its use of federalism for governance that we can trace settler narratives. For example, in settler Canada, we rely on the notion that Indigenous matters of governance, in fact, in many cases, Indigenous peoples themselves, are a matter of federal power. We refer to federal jurisdiction to capture this decision-making power. Yet, in my book, I also outline the many ways that the provinces have decision-making power or jurisdiction. This role is ignored. I argue this omittance is a colonial power play. This is because the scholarship on settler colonial narratives is very clear. Settler operations will omit and ignore colonial operations of dispossession because it supports the colonial order. And on this, I write in my book, when settler colonial mechanics operate in ways that are ignored or go unnoticed, a pervasive power dynamic remains obscure. At this time of reconciliation, it is crucial to include provincial roles in the national dialogue on reconciliatory change. Now, I want to be clear. I am not advocating for provincial jurisdiction or powers over Indigenous peoples. Instead, as I write, no settler colonial government should deprive Indigenous peoples of political agency. However, while the settler colonial state is operable, it is important that it fulfill its constitutional fiduciary obligations. Every day that the provinces are not actively involved in improving the lives of Indigenous peoples and promoting indigeneity is a day that the provinces are failing to meet the evolving mandate of contemporary federalism. Now, there are long-standing arguments as to whether the provinces should or shouldn't be at this negotiating table. Many point to upholding nation-to-nation relations or those of Indigenous nations and the federal crown. They might argue that provincial presence can disrupt or even dilute this diplomatic arrangement. My book considers these discussions. Ultimately, as I describe in my book's introduction, I am reflecting scholarly and public policy debate, not explicitly directing the path forward. As I write, in this way, I observe and comment on, but do not dictate, a path forward for reconciliation in settler Canada. That said, by tracing the ways the state has indeed carved out the space of jurisdiction for provinces in Indigenous political matters, I argue that these roles are ignored in favor of the federal mandate. This federal mandate is recorded in Canada's Constitution Act, Section 9124. It reads, in short, quote, Indians and Indian lands, end quote, are a federal mandate. When this federal power is the focus, we see a tandem colonial order emerge in the structure and operation of federalism. First, we can see clearly the federal colonial power of wardship. Second, settler colonial narratives of dispossession or those silenced injustices will manifest when provincial jurisdiction is ignored. Here, Canada's story, based on these settler power division, remains unchallenged by reconciliation. And to support this argument, I spend a full chapter looking at the structure and institutions of federalism. This includes what the Constitution, legislation, case law, and policy say about this arrangement of divided powers. I often say this is a good chapter if you're having trouble sleeping at night. But especially important in this chapter is the mapping of those provincial roles. And so I write, in fact, the provinces exercise a wide range of roles with respect to Indigenous peoples. Accordingly, the provinces have both political and legal responsibilities for Indigenous people, and these responsibilities have consistently increased since the end of World War II through devolution and provincial encroachment. I then spent a whole other chapter considering what federalism as a system of political organization contributes to this argument. For example, federalism is a dynamic and changing arrangement of power. I map its evolution from colonial to classic to competitive dimensions. Within this mapping, I consider colonizing efforts of the state in balance with episodes of Indigenous resistance and anti-colonial action. Of course, at work in this evolution is that equation of inequity that upholds settler colonialism. That is, Indigenous dispossession for settler benefit. And when Canada's story is built on this premise of dispossession, its federalist systems or its governing institutions and their behaviors will reproduce colonial inequities. Now, within these two chapters, there are several competing complexities at play. And I map many of these tensions around terms like agency, autonomy, sovereignty. Now, these are highly contentious and complex terms in Canada. And on this, I write, agency is a political concept that refers to decision-making capacity. The concept of autonomy articulates the capacity for individuals or a collective to exercise agency unencumbered by external interference. Politically speaking, the agency and autonomy of Indigenous peoples in settler colonial Canada can be understood through three generalized concepts: self-determination, self-government, and sovereignty. To illustrate the complexity of these three political concepts, let's consider Indigenous peoples' rights in settler Canada. I'm sure you all know that Indigenous peoples have long-standing, pre-existing, or inherent rights that are not sourced by the Canadian state. These rights have come to be recognized by Canadian law and the Constitution. In any settler colonial context, the colonized are subjected to a complex process of rights recognition and rights erasure. And Indigenous peoples' rights in what has become Canada are caught up in this schism. And this is due to the intent of assimilation. Now, I have learned from Native American Indian scholar Jody Bird that this process is what she calls a cacophony. This term underscores the contradiction in that tandem application of rights recognition and rights erasure. And so it's in light of this contradiction that I write, Indigenous nations have effective political and constitutional standing in Canadian government, yet federalism remains a structure of divided powers that by design withholds fundamental access to sovereignty from Indigenous peoples. But of course, federalism is flexible and it's evolving. While this system has shifted from the colonial to the collaborative to competitive models, with many other approaches in between, each of these federalist arrangements is based on colonial intent. Now, this can even be said of practices of devolution, where in a federation, we see power move from one order of government to another. Devolution can arguably put decision-making powers more squarely in the hands of Indigenous nations. However, the benefit of this approach is debatable. For example, Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard calls for caution in these kinds of Canadian state operations. On this, I write, Coulthard's politics of recognition is integral for seeing through the illusionary work of the Canadian state, which has used these types of opportunities to draw Indigenous peoples further into the state through assimilation tactics. Coulthard explains that the Canadian state has modified relations with Indigenous peoples from outright assimilation and genocidal tactics to a focus on the recognition and accommodation of Indigenous peoples' political agency. Essentially, what Coulthard explains in fancy words is that reconciliation can be a colonial tactic. It can pull Indigenous peoples into the state instead of changing the state. This entangles Indigenous peoples further into that equation of dispossession. Indeed, reconciliation for many is not a path towards liberation, but a recolonizing process. Arguments such as Bird's cacophony or Coulthard's recognition demonstrate that the story of Canada can be easily manipulated by narratives of benevolent power sharing. They also demonstrate that settler political arrangements are complex, and I think that's easy for many of us in this room to appreciate. Because of these complexities, my final chapter considers a range of solutions. Now, these are drawn from both domestic and international political and legal theorists. Some of these solutions are what I would call accommodationist responses. On that, I write, by this, I mean approaches to the federalist system marked by little to no transformative structural change. These approaches may make marginally new and different kinds of space within the political system for continued colonial power relations. And so these are items that you've probably heard of, such as making reserves into municipalities. Now, while I don't think that these are real or viable solutions, I do include them in my book because I often hear folks query these as potential solutions. Next, I considered the post-colonial approach of treaty federalism. This approach enhances Indigenous political power in Canadian federalism. It brings together treaty, which is a traditional Indigenous practice of diplomacy, with federalist power sharing, which is also understood to be rooted in Indigenous diplomacy. On this, I write, this constitutional arrangement does not, importantly, demand that Indigenous peoples surrender to the colonial order and instead respects their unique or sui generis and independent legal orders, which are distinct and do not derive from Canadian colonial systems. This emphasis on respect for Indigenous legal orders is central to treaty federalism. Now, some argue that because the Canadian political system is already based on both federalism and existing treaty frameworks, it already includes the necessary pieces to implement this approach. I also offer a concept borrowed from international relations called multi-plural or pluriversal sovereignties. Here, theorists disrupt the normative idea that sovereignty belongs only to the state. They argue sovereignty can be shared with other political units that are not state beings. This approach allows the political order of an Indigenous nation or a community to share more decision-making power with the feds and the provinces. Finally, and most importantly in my view, I walk the reader through solutions derived from Indigenous resurgent work. Indigenous peoples in what has become Canada have always adhered to political practices. Many activists and scholars are working with knowledge carriers and through Indigenous languages to bring these practices into contemporary resistance and decolonial movements. Now, to explain this, I write, these ancestral knowledges, far from being relics of the past, are contemporary sources of resistance to colonial dispossession and assimilation, offering robust alternatives to settler colonial paths. This resurgence work is, of course, due to the ongoing settler colonial inequities. Indeed, this story of building Canada through Indigenous dispossession is not complete. It is ongoing. In light of this, I probe the subtitle of my book, Reconciliation. Canada has been working from a standpoint of reconciliation for some time. I argue that this movement ignores the political arrangement and operation of federalism. If we continue to ignore the settler colonial bearings of federalist power sharing, we can't really move forward with reconciliation. Instead, colonial injustices remain entrenched. Now, it would be fair to say reconciliation is a complex and divisive topic in Canada. You might even have conflicting feelings or thoughts about it. I do. I understand reconciliation as an important shift in national consciousness. It is born from the decades-long adversity and advocacy of survivors and intergenerational survivors of Indian residential schools. Survivor truth-telling is resistance. Truth-telling is, after all, an act of rebellion. Now, I think the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, did a good job mapping the first steps for all Canadians to take up reconciliation to effect a better Canada. For me, this better Canada is one that changes that equation I mentioned. That is, settler colonialism is operational through Indigenous dispossession for settler benefit. Undoing this equation is central to reconciliation. Of course, the TRC says, essentially, here are 94 ways to get started on this. You might wonder where to start with a structure like federalism. As a professor of political science, most curriculums will introduce federalism as a system that pervades each aspect of Canada's political order. By this, I mean all of our political institutions and processes are structured by power division and sharing. It's near impossible to create a blueprint for its operation, let alone one to elicit reconciliation. Pulling from Indigenous resurgence theories, I summarize the following as a way to bring federalism into the conversation on reconciliation. Here you might notice that elements from those other solutions I noted do also surface here. So I write, we have seen how Indigenous resurgence can guide the process of reconciliation. Indigenous knowledges are rooted in specific places and ancestral traditions. Therefore, reconciliation efforts should be tailored to the unique locations of place and colonial or decolonial experiences of Indigenous nations. Indigenous resurgence movements seek to dismantle colonial structures and advocate for multi-plural sovereignty and renewed treaty relationships. Consequently, reconciliation efforts should embrace a multifaceted approach that understands Indigenous political autonomy as sovereign. Strong emphasis on the truth component of reconciliation is required. Learning about and deeply understanding the ongoing colonial injustices and inequities that subordinate Indigenous peoples' political authority is needed to address the issues through structural change. Lastly, Indigenous resurgence movements encourage us to ask new questions about the issues we want to address, steering us away from colonial logics and toward Indigenous-centered solutions. When settler colonial narratives, such as those supporting federalism, serve the colonial state, there is clear need for reconciliatory efforts to redress its structural advantage. Of course, federalism is only one aspect of political organization in Canada. Other structures and systems exist too. As well, economic and social organization also generate colonial inequities in our country. The TRC is clear in the breadth of work that must occur to foster reconciliation. It must take up all of these components of the political, social, and economic orders. Also, we need the courage of survivor truth-telling, the resistance, and the rebellion. This has been fundamental to changing parts of Canada's story. Now, clearly, the call for reconciliation is wide-sweeping. Within it, I argue a central concern ought to be untangling the colonial power differentials instilled and operationalized by federalism itself. Without this, the story of Canada's inequitable equation will continue. And with that, I say hi, which in the language of many elders I work with back home in Treaty 4 means that is all, we are finished. And I also offer in the language of my grandmother, Marzi Kekiao Awiak, which sort of means I am grateful for us all gathering here. Thank you. All right, well, I'm just gonna go into professor mode here. So we have some time for Q&A. I think we kind of wanna keep it short to do some more visiting because this room is filled with so many people that I love, and also you could like text or email me if you had questions. But I also want to say, you know, it's very rare to do that for me to do this talk and just see so many people that I'm essentially quoting or who is shaping this content, like Julia, Leo, Chantal, like I just, Amanda, like I see your faces and I know your work so well, and you know, especially, you know, Julia's hand has guided so much of my work. And yeah, so I digress. Are there any questions? I will continue talking. So a dear friend of this second row, these beautiful four women, our dear friend lives in Amsterdam. And she mentioned having some trouble sleeping, and I mailed her a copy and said, we're not friends, have the solution. I'm sorry, unless you love political science, which many people do. I love sitting down and talking about federalism. It's interesting to me. Chantal.
So you mentioned reconciliation can become like co-opted as a tactic of colonialism. Do you have any suggestions on how we can resist that?
Not yes and no. I mean, I guess it depends sort of like who's at the table contributing to the conversation and leading decisions. You know, is it Indigenous led? Is it led in a good way by knowledge keepers? But I would also say, because I'm a professor of political science, like I'm always thinking about one of the things that theory tells us, in particular critical theory, is it's always going to be like that. You know, whatever radical political change occurs along the margins will always be pulled into the center and diluted in that way. And so the system just continues.
Any questions?
Question that comes to my mind. Federal government. And Confederation is an interesting setup in that we have two provincial governments in this country that are actively mandated to separate. You know, for Saskatchewan, globally to Saskatchewan. But in that dialogue, I don't hear enough, very, very little about First Nations contribution to that conversation. I heard in Quebec, Quebec separate, when the Cree don't want any part of separation. But that's I know that's not directly what you're talking about.
Yes, I have actually. This is my father, ladies and gentlemen, who also very, very closely read my dissertation, which this book is largely based upon. So I feel like he has like a bit of a upper hand here with this question, just in terms of how well he knows my work. But you know, when I was in undergrad at the University of Winnipeg, that was certainly the resistance to Quebec separating from Indigenous nations and peoples throughout the province was definitely something that I learned about. In Alberta, recently, since Trump 2.0, since Carney has taken office, I have noted in a number of instances in the media, a lot of Indigenous people standing up and asserting sovereignty against the idea that Alberta would separate. I've noticed constitutional experts who have said that's actually just not even really possible with the way the Constitution is framed. But I also want to give a little plug for some future research that I've got cooking up. There are over 500 newspaper articles from the time Kearney and now Bill C5, which is sort of that big One Economy Act in Canada, to the end of the summer, where Indigenous peoples have asserted said sovereignty. And so, I mean, like, we can find it when we look for it. Clearly, I used a computer to look for that for me, and I am now assembling that as data. But it's there. All right, well, how about we move over to book signing, if anyone wants their book signed, and if you have other questions, feel free to pose them during that time. Thank you, everyone.
Exactly, we're going to move on to the signing portion. So feel free to approach the signing table here to my right to have a book signed, and feel free to do so before you visit the cash desk. So long as you visit them before you leave, that's what they care about for that. A big thank you again to all of you for being here tonight, both in person and online. We had a really good turnout, even with the cold. Fantastic. Another big thank you to Tanya and Sechko for coming here today, and to Fernwood Publishing. Oh yeah, let's give a round of applause for them. Round of applause for Emily Grafton.